Good morning, all of you. I, Dr. Devis Bandal, Associate Professor, Suresh Gyan Vihar University, accredited by NAC A grade. Today, I will discuss about types of entity and attributes. You know, entity and attributes both are part of your entity relationship diagram. So, before starting the entity and attributes, I am giving overview of your entity relationship diagram. Entity relationship diagram means relationship between entities and means relation exists between your entities. This is your entity relationship diagram. Through the entity relationship diagram, you can define the whole enterprise. Suppose you want to make a entity relationship diagram of your college. So through the ER diagram, you can define all entities which are included in your college system, all attributes, all relations. Means, through the ER diagram, you can define the whole enterprise. Basically, that is the purpose of your ER diagram. And here in this lecture, I will discuss about what are the types of your entities and what are the types of your attributes. Now I am presenting my screen. I hope you can see my screen. So today's lecture title is that types of entity and attributes. I will cover so many topics in this lecture, like object and outcome of this lecture, what is entity, what are the types of your entity, what is attribute, and types of attributes. And also, I will explain the relationship between the entities. Your this subject means your object, your entities and your attributes both are topics of your DBMS. DBMS, database management system. Database management system where you will store the data and your data will organize in a manner. So that is your DBMS. Your without database, your software is nothing. When you will make any software, in the software there are two parts. First part is your front end and second part is your back end. In your front part, you will take any programming language like your C++, Java, etc. And in your backend part, you will take the database. Like, suppose you are making a software of your college management system. Suppose you are making a software for your fee receipt system. Okay, so in your fee receipt system, if you are not taking the database, so your fee receipt system is nothing, because without the database you can't access the all students list of your college. You have no any record that this particular student have already submit the fees or not. That's why your database management system, your DBMS, is must compulsory in your software. Okay, every time when you will make a software, obviously, always you will take the database. Okay, and here I am discussing about the object and outcome of this lecture. Object is that concept, the entity and attribute. This is the main object of this lecture. And if we will talk about the outcomes of this lecture, the student will able to understand the concept of your entity, and also student will understand the concept of your attribute, and also to be able to all types of your understand concept of your attributes and your entity. And now I'm coming, the topic is your entity. Entity, you know, entity is the person, place, or thing. Entity which have some characteristics, which have some features, is called the entity. Like your student, like your person, like table. These are your all entity, because these are all having the some characteristics, because these are all having attributes. These are all having properties. Properties called the attributes. Okay. So suppose you are taking an entity that is your student. So student having some properties. Some properties like student name, student father name, student mother name, student address, student city. These are the all features. These are the all characteristics of student entity. And if we will talk about the another entity like your employee. Employee also have some characteristics. Employee also have employee also have some features like your employee name, employee father name, employee mother name, employee date of joining, employee salary, uh, employee incentive, etc., etc. There are so many features of your employee. So these are the all attributes. These are the all fields which are attributes of a particular entity employee. You know, that's why you can say that an entity is a real world thing which can be distinctly identified like a person, place, or a concept. It is an object which is distinguishable from the others. If we cannot distinguish it from others, then it is object, not an entity. You know, entity entity is your person or thing, person or a place or your thing. If you can distinguish from the others, then it is your entity. And if you can't distinguish from the others, this is not entity, this is your object. Entity entity are classified in two categories. First is your tangible entity, and the second is your intangible entity. Tangible entity means, from the name tangible, tangible means which exist in your real world, is called the tangible. Tangible entities are both entities which are exist in your real world physically. Like your person, obviously person will exist in your real world physically. Car is exist in your real world physically. Cycle, these are all tangible entity, because these are all existing in your real world. And second is your intangible entity. Intangible just reverse of your tangible. If we will talk about the intangible, the intangible is just a reverse of your tangible. Your tangible was which exist in your real world physically, and in your, if we will talk about the intangible part, so which exist is not in your real world physically. This is your intangible entity. For example, like bank account. Bank account is your intangible entity because your bank account is not exist in your real world in your physically mode. That's why your bank account is the intangible entity. And now, if we are taking an example, if we have table of a student, suppose I am having a table of student, and I want to take the columns in this particular table, like your roll number, student name, student father name, student mother name, student course, student address, student mobile number, student email ID. Then each student in this table is an entity because each student which are already inserted in this table, which are already existing in this table, can be uniquely identified by their roll number. Obviously, if roll number is the one field of the student record, so through the roll number, you can identify the particular student. For example, if we will talk about the employee table, if your employee table, there are so many fields in this employee table, like your employee name, employee father name, employee salary, employee date of joining, etc, etc, employee PAN card, employee Aadhaar card. You know, through the employee PAN card and through the employee Aadhaar card, you can identify a particular employee because Aadhaar card is a unique, PAN card is a unique of your employee. Like your student roll number is unique, and through the student roll number, you can identify the particular student, and through the PAN card and through the Aadhaar card, you can identify a particular employee. And now I am taking a example of your in your student table. Here I have mentioned a table student. The table name is that student, and the roll number is the one field of this table. Student is the second field of this table. Age is the third field of this table, and mobile number is the fourth field of your table. You know, I had inserted four records in this student table, and which have one roll number, two roll number, three roll number, and your fourth roll number. These your all records are the entity because all are having the same attributes. And here in this slide, I had mentioned in a rectangle box in which roll number 2, student name, Angel, age is your 19, and your mobile number is this is your entity. Because through this roll number, that is your 2, you can identify a Angel, that is your student name. If you are taking the 3 roll number, so you can identify a particular student, Priya. And if we will talk about the entity type, what is the entity type? You know, the entity type is a collection of your entity having similar attributes. It's called the sorry, entity type is the collection of entity having the similar attributes in the above student table example, we have each row as an entity because they are all having the same types of attributes. That is, each row has its own roll number, each row has its own name, each row its own roll number, each row its own age, and each row its own the mobile number. Means each row having the similar type of your attributes, like your roll number, age, student name, and your mobile. So we can define the above student table is an entity type because it is a collection of your entities having the same attributes. So entity, the main key point is that the entity type is the collection of entity which have similar type of your attributes. This is your entity type. Entity type is an ER diagram is defined by a name. Here I'm taking a name is the student. When you will draw a ER diagram, in about the ER diagram, I had already discussed. I had already given the overview of an ER diagram, entity relationship diagram, where you will define the relationship between the all entities of your enterprise. So here I am taking the entity type defined via ER diagram is defined via name, here student, and a set of attributes like your roll number, student name, age, and your mobile number. This table below show how the data as data of different entities, different students are stored. you know in your when you will draw a ER diagram, you will mention the all entities, you will mention the entity type, you will mention the relation between the entities, how your one entity is related from the another entity. Like your, suppose as per I had told, suppose you are drawing a ER diagram of your college management system, where your student is your entity, your teacher is your entity. So how you will define the relation between your student and your teacher, how you will define the relation between your student and your course, how you will define the relation between two entities like your teacher and your subject. So through the ER diagram, you can define the whole over enterprise. And in ER diagram, you will mention the all type of your entities and what is the relation between the all type of your entities. And here I had taken a table as per you can see, in which your roll number is your one attribute, student name is your one attribute, age is your one attribute, and mobile number is your one attribute, and your entity type is your student. Here I had mentioned the student as your entity type because having the similar types of your attributes. Okay, like your roll number, each row having roll number, each row having student name, each row having age, and each row having mobile number. And your entity, all are the entity which have one roll number, student name Andrew, age is 18, and mobile number is this. This is your entity. And in the same manner, which have roll number is 2, 3, and 4. These are the all entities. And now, after discussed about the entity and your entity type and the categories of your entity, now I am talking about the types of your entity. Types of your entity, there are too many types of your entity. First is your strong type entity, and the second is your weak entity. When you will draw the ER diagram, So your strong entity will you will mention in your EI diagram, and your weak entity you will mention in your EI diagram. And I will discuss about the all types of your entity one by one. First, I will discuss about the strong entity. You know, strong entity are those entity type which has a key attribute. About the key attribute, I will explain after some PPTs, and now you can understand through only key attribute. Strong entity are those entity type which has key attribute, and the primary key help in identifying the each entity uniquely. And here your primary key is a new word in this lecture. Primary key, you know, through the primary key you can identify a record. Through the primary key you can identify a tuple. Tuple equal to the record, like your records having attribute and your tuple having attributes. So you can say to attribute as a tuple. Sorry, you can say record as a tuple. Primary key, through the primary key you can identify a particular record. Like I'm taking an example as per I had told in starting of this lecture. Suppose I am having a table of employee, and there are so many characteristics of your employee table, so many attributes of this employee table, like your employee name, father name, employee PAN card, employee salary, employee date of joining, employee Aadhaar card, and your employee ID. These are the all attributes of your employee table. And I want to define the primary key in this table through which you can identify a particular employee. In this table, you know, each employee having uniquely ID card, each employee having uniquely PAN card, each employee having uniquely Aadhaar card. But through the PAN card and through the Aadhaar card, you can identify a particular employee. So your PAN card and your Aadhaar card are your primary key. You can take the one attribute, and also you can take the more than one attribute as your primary key. There is no any foundation key in your primary key. You will take only more than one attribute. You will take only more than you will take only one attribute. There is no any foundation for the primary key. If you want to define the primary key, so you can take the one record, one attribute of this record, and also you can take the more than one attributes of the record for identify a primary key. So strong entity are those entity which have a key attribute, and the primary key help in identifying each entity uniquely. It is represented by a rectangle. Always when you will define the strong entity in your ER diagram, so you will always define the strong entity in your rectangular box. Okay. As per example, roll number. Roll number is your strong entity in the above mentioned table. As per I had taken the table of your student, in which roll number is your key attribute. That's why your roll number identify each element of the table uniquely. So your roll number identify each element of the table uniquely, and hence so we can say that student is a strong entity type, because student having roll number is one of the key attribute, and through the roll number you can identify particular student. That's why your student will strong entity. And when you will define the strong entity in your ER diagram, so you will define the student entity in your rectangular box. And now I can take the another example of your strong entity. As per I had told, your employee is your strong entity, because the one of the key attribute of employee is your employee ID. Through the employee ID you can identify a particular employee. That's why your employee is your strong entity. And when you will define the strong entity in your ER diagram, so you will always take the rectangular box, and in your rectangular box you will define the strong entity. I had taken a example in through the image, through the diagram, in which I had mentioned the strong entity type. You know, student student is mentioned in your rectangular box. That's why your student is your strong entity, and the all attributes are mentioned in your ellipse, like your mobile number of your student, or roll number ID of your student, age of your student, gender of your student, and your name of your student. So as per I had told, through the roll number you can identify a particular student. This is your strong entity type. And if we will talk about the weak entity, a strong entity is the one of the type of your entity, and your weak entity is the another type of your entity. Weak entity type just reverse of your strong entity type. A strong entity always have a key attribute, and your weak entity type does not have a key attribute. Weak entity type cannot be identified on its own. It depends on the some other strong entity for its distinct identity. And also, you can say that about the weak entity, if your one entity is depend on your another entity, is called the weak entity. This can be understood with a real world, real life example. There can be a children only if the parent exists. There can be no independent existence of your children. There can be a room only if building exists. There can be a no independent existence of room. A weak entity is represented by a double rectangular box, and where your strong entity will represented in your single rectangular box, and your weak entity will represent in your double rectangular box. So the main key point, you will focus in your weak entity if your one entity is depend on your another entity. That is your weak entity, like your bank account number. Your bank account number is based on your bank. As per I had told, a weak entity represented by a double outline rectangular. This relation between a weak entity type and your strong entity type is called the identifying relation, and shown within a double outline diamond. When I am talking about the weak entity, so as per I had said, if your one entity is depend on your another entity, is called the weak entity. And your weak entity always defined in your double rectangular box. And when you will define the relationship, that time you will take the double diamond shape, the double outline diamond shape. Okay. And now After entity, I will discuss about the attribute. Attribute attribute means I had told your entity have some characteristics. Entity have some features. So your characteristics of your entity, your features of your entity is called the attribute. Like your, as per I had told, student is your entity, and the student characteristics are roll number, name, father name, mother name, ID, etc., etc. So these are the all characteristics. So these are the all features of your student. So these are the all features. All features are called the attributes. All characteristics is called the all characteristics of the entity is called the attributes. Attributes are the descriptive properties which are owned via each entity of an entity set. There exists a specific domain on set of values for which for each attribute from where the attribute can takes its value. So the main key point about the attribute, characteristics of entities are called the attributes, features of entity are called the attributes. And now I am talking about the types of attribute. Types of, there are so many types of your attribute. Simple attribute, composite attribute, single value attribute, multi-valued attribute, and your derived attribute and key attribute. So these are the all types of your attribute, like your simple attribute, composite attribute, single value attribute, multi-valued attribute, derived attribute, and your key attribute. And I will discuss all types of your attribute one by one through the PPT. First, I am taking the simple attribute. Simple attribute are those attributes which cannot further divided. Simple attribute are those attributes which cannot be divided further. Is called the simple attribute. Means you can't divide it the further to the simple attribute. For example, suppose student is your entity, and you can see in this image student entity is represented in your rectangular box, and roll number, class, and age. These are the all attributes of student entity. You know, these are the all features. These are the all characteristics of your student: roll number, class, age. And you can see in this diagram, you can't divide it the roll number further. You can't divide it the class further. You can't divide it the age further. That's why you can see your roll number, class, and your age is your simple attribute, because you can't divide it the further. This is the example of your simple attribute. The main key point in your simple attribute, if you can't divide it the further, is called the simple attribute. And now I am talking about the composite attribute. Composite attribute, composite attribute are those attributes which are composed of many other simple attributes. Means your composite attribute are those attributes which are composed from other attributes. For example, student. Student is your entity, and roll number is your attribute of student entry. street, city, country, address, state, and name. All are the attributes of your student entity. And here in this image, you can see your name is consist from your first name, from middle name, and your last name. Like your suppose name is your Mohan Kumar Gupta. So Mohan is your first name, Kumar is your middle name, and Gupta is your last name. And when you will compose the first name, middle name, and your last name, after composed the after composed, make a name. Okay, so means composite attribute, as per I had told, are those attributes which are composed of many other simple attributes, are called the composite attributes. Here you have to make the name from the simple attribute first name, middle name, and your last name. And the same address, when you will mention an address, so always you will mention the street name, always you will mention the city name, always you will mention the country name, always you will mention the state. Means your address is your composite attribute, because it is made from the simple attributes like street, city, country, and your state. And now I am talking about the single value attribute. Single value attribute are those attributes who have only single value, which cannot take only one value for a given entity. Like your age. Age is the attribute of your entity student. The age is the only single value. Date of birth. Date of birth is only the single value. Gender is only the single value, either male and either female. And roll number is the single value. That's why your roll number, age, date of birth, and gender, these are the all single value attributes, because all attributes have the only single value. And now another types of attribute is that multi-valued attribute. Multi-valued. You can understand from the name multi-valued means in this multi-valued attribute, your attribute will have the multiple value. Means multi-valued attribute are those attributes which have more than one value. Like that, phone number, like email ID. A student can have more than one mobile number. A student can have more than one email ID. That's why your mail ID and your phone number are the multi-valued attribute, because have the more than one value. Example, I had taken mobile number and your email ID. Your multi-valued attribute always represent in your double ellipse. So here you can see in this image your mobile number of a student and email ID of a student is mentioned in your double rectangle, because each student have more than one mobile number and have more than one email ID. And derived attribute. Derived attribute, if you are facing any interview regarding your attribute, so derived attribute always ask from you. Derived attribute, derived attribute are those attribute which can be derived from the other attribute. It's called the derived attribute. Okay. A derived attribute is not directly present in your database, because this attribute is derived from the another attribute. For example, like age. Age is your attribute and your date of birth is attribute. Age is not mentioned in your database directly, not physically, but date of birth is mentioned as physically in your database. If you end through the date of birth attribute, you can identify the age. You can find the age from the date of birth. How is possible? This is possible from the simple calculation. Just directly your date of birth will subtract from your current date, and you can find the age of your person. Suppose the person date of birth is mentioned in your database, that is your 76, and present date is that your 21 century. Okay, so you can subtract the date of birth, that is your 76th century. Okay, means 1976, and your present date is 2021. So you just directly subtract from the 2021 minus 1976, and you can find the age. So age is your derived attribute, and your derived attribute is not physically mentioned in your database, and your derived attribute is always mentioned in your dashed ellipse. This is the indication of your derived attribute. You can see in this image, student is your entity, roll number, gender, date of birth, and age. These are the all characteristics of student entity, and roll number is mentioned in your single rectangle, and your gender is mentioned in your single rectangle, and date of birth is mentioned in your simple uh, uh, ellipse. Roll number, gender, date of birth are also are mentioned in your ellipse, and your age is your derived attribute, because this attribute is mentioned in your dashed ellipse. Okay, and last is that the key attribute. Key attribute are those attributes which can identify an entity uniquely in your entity set. For example, roll number. Roll number is your attribute, key attribute, because this attribute you can identify a particular student. And after studied this lecture, student will able to give the answer for what is entity, what is attribute, what are the types of your entity, what is tangible entity, what is intangible entity, what is strong entity, weak entity, simple attribute, derived attribute, multiple attribute, and or key attribute. And I had already discussed about the all types of questions which are related from your this lecture. Thank you.